March 2nd, 1944, 25,000 feet above Metz, occupied France. Inside a dimly lit German radar station, a young operator squinted at his instruments, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. The air was thick with anticipation. The usual buzzing of enemy aircraft had vanished. Radios that just minutes before had been alive with chatter now hissed with emptiness. Technicians adjusted dials. Officers murmured. Something was wrong, but no one knew what. There was no signal, no warning, no sound. For months, German radar crews had grown used to the distant hum of American bombers approaching from the west. They came in waves, loud and deliberate, escorted by fighters that howled across the sky like mechanical wolves. The Luftwaffe had learned to recognize the distinct acoustic signature of each type, the throaty rumble of B-17s, the whistling speed of Mustangs, the sharp bark of 50 caliber guns mid-fire. But today, there was nothing, just a silence so thick it made the skin crawl. That silence was not peace. It was a predator waiting to strike. Hans Meissner, a radar technician stationed near Metz, would later recall that moment in his diary. The noise stopped so suddenly I thought our system had failed. I looked around, expecting someone to confirm a malfunction, but no, everything was working. It was the sky that had gone quiet, completely, unnaturally quiet, and that was the moment fear crept in. It's easy to forget how much humans rely on sound to understand danger. We flinch at thunder. We brace for an incoming roar, but when that sound is taken from us, when the expected scream of engines is replaced by void, the imagination fills the gap. For the Germans on the ground, that gap was filled with dread. There's a term pilots use, situational awareness, but on that day there was no awareness, just waiting, just breath held tight and hearts pounding against uniforms that felt suddenly too small. Unknown to them, miles above, twin-boomed shadows drifted silently through the icy air. The P-38 Lightnings were already in position. The aircraft had earned a reputation among Allied pilots. Fast, agile, and unorthodox, it looked like something out of a science fiction novel. 2 engines, twin tails, a sleek cockpit nestled in the center like the eye of a storm. It wasn't the most maneuverable in a dogfight, but at high altitude and long range, it was unmatched, especially when it struck without warning. One of the P-38s circling above that day belonged to Lieutenant Michael S. Hanley, a 23-year-old pilot from Oregon. Known among his squadron as Ghost Mike, he had become infamous for his precision strikes and his obsession with silence. While other pilots reveled in engine growls and roaring formations, Hanley preferred the approach no one saw coming. He once said in a letter home, "Noise is for celebration, silence is for war," and silence was exactly what he delivered that day. As the Germans scrambled for answers, the first bombs hit. Supply depots erupted in flame. Communication centers lost power. Anti-aircraft crews spun their guns in confusion, unsure where to aim. By the time they identified the threat, it was already too late. The P-38s were pulling out of their dives, vanishing into the sun, leaving behind only chaos and smoke. The attack lasted less than 7 minutes, but it left an impression far deeper than any single bombing run. It introduced a new kind of psychological warfare, one not defined by what you could hear, but by what you couldn't. Word spread quickly through German ranks. Some said the Americans had developed a stealth plane. Others whispered about new tactics, new engines, perhaps even new types of aircraft that couldn't be tracked. But the truth was simpler and more terrifying. It wasn't a new plane. It was an old one used differently. The P-38 hadn't changed, but the way it was flown, the way it used the sky, used the silence, had. Soldiers began to dread the quiet. To them, it meant death was already en route. Some officers began issuing false alarms just to see how quickly their men could respond. Others tried to ignore it. But in the stillness of dawn, when the wind stopped and the birds held their breath, even the bravest men would glance upward, scanning for movement, listening for nothing. One German lieutenant noted in his field report, "The enemy has mastered the art of vanishing. We are now hunted not by sound, but by silence." And that changed everything. Because once you remove the sound, you remove the warning. And once there is no warning, there is no defense. It was the beginning of a pattern, one that would repeat across France, Belgium, and into the heart of Germany. Lightning strikes without thunder, death without noise, shadows without form. The Luftwaffe's control of the skies began to slip, not in great battles, but in 1,000 moments of confusion. Not by overwhelming force, but by a silence that crept in before the storm. Even today, veterans remember the fear of that absence. Not the roar of engines, but their disappearance, because when the sky went quiet, it meant only one thing: Someone up there had already made their decision. Someone up there had already chosen the target. If this story gave you chills, let us know in the comments. Share your thoughts and memories, or tell us what moments in history you think the world has forgotten. And if you want to keep exploring untold stories like this, subscribe to the channel. Your voice helps bring history back to life. It looked strange even to American pilots. Long and narrow, with two engines mounted on extended booms, twin tail fins rising like sharp horns, and a cockpit suspended between them like a capsule detached from the rest of the plane. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning didn't just fly differently, it looked like it came from another war entirely. German pilots had a nickname for it, der Gabelschwanz Teufel, the fork-tailed devil. They feared it not because it was the fastest or the most agile, but because it broke the rules of what a fighter should be. It didn't chase you, it intercepted you. It didn't bark with noise, it hunted in silence. And when you finally saw it, it was already too late. The P-38 was a twin-engine, long-range, high-altitude predator. It could fly over 3,600 kilometers with drop tanks, reaching targets deep inside enemy territory, well beyond the operational limits of most single-engine fighters. Its ceiling was nearly 13,000 meters, allowing it to soar above German interceptors and dive at blistering speeds. But perhaps its most overlooked asset wasn't in its speed or its firepower, it was in how it approached. Unlike other American fighters, the P-38 had counter-rotating propellers that neutralized torque. This allowed it to climb fast, remain stable at high altitudes, and dive without the spiraling instability that plagued other planes. When in a shallow descent, especially with throttles eased back, the Lightning could approach with startling quietness. Its engines didn't scream, they whispered. Pilots quickly realized that with the right conditions, altitude, throttle control, weather, they could appear over a target almost without sound, and that revelation changed the way missions were planned. Instead of engaging in long, noisy formations, Lightning squadrons began practicing quiet approaches. They would fan out, reduce power, and let gravity carry them toward their prey. The silence wasn't just a side effect, it became the weapon. In the summer of 1943, a squadron of P-38s led by Captain Julian Rice executed a mission over a German rail junction in northern Italy. The plan was simple, a high-altitude glide with throttles at idle. No radio chatter, no aggressive descent, just a slow, steady drop. The German anti-aircraft gunners didn't react until the first explosions shattered the tracks. Witnesses on the ground later said they never heard a thing until the bombs were already falling. One of the most distinctive features of the Lightning was its central armament. Unlike other fighters that had wing-mounted guns, requiring convergence at specific distances, the P-38 housed all of its weapons in the nose. 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon fired straight ahead in a tight pattern, making it deadly accurate. When it opened fire, it was like a scalpel through the air, direct, focused, and lethal. That nose-mounted configuration meant that the Lightning could engage enemies at greater distances without sacrificing precision. It didn't need to outmaneuver, it only needed one clean shot. German bombers especially hated it. With the Lightning's speed and nose firepower, it could pass through a formation and tear through engines before the gunners even got a fix. But for all its advantages, the P-38 was not an easy aircraft to master. Early models had issues with compressibility, a phenomenon where, in high-speed dives, the air pressure around the aircraft caused control surfaces to lock up. Some pilots lost their lives simply because they couldn't pull up in time. Lockheed engineers responded by modifying dive flaps and adjusting control surfaces. It took time, it took lives, but it worked. Once those issues were addressed, the P-38 became more than just a fighter. It became a platform, a jack of all trades. It served as a long-range escort, a tactical bomber, a photo reconnaissance aircraft, even a pathfinder for other bombers. Its versatility wasn't just impressive, it was terrifying. In the Pacific theater, P-38s escorted bombers on missions that spanned thousands of kilometers. They flew President Roosevelt across the Atlantic in a stripped-down variant. They shot down Admiral Yamamoto's plane in one of the most precise interception missions of the war. But in Europe, the Lightning had a more subtle legacy. It was the plane that taught the Germans to fear what they couldn't hear. To them, the Lightning was a ghost. It didn't follow traditional rules of engagement. It didn't challenge you head-on. It used altitude, silence, and surprise. It was less like a fighter, more like a hunter, always watching, always above, waiting. Some Luftwaffe pilots learned to recognize its silhouette, But by the time they spotted it, the Lightning was already in firing position. They'd try to climb, turn, fight back, but the twin engines and high-speed dives made escape nearly impossible. It wasn't just a fight, it was an execution. And yet, for all its capability, the P-38 never gained the cultural mythos of the Mustang or the Spitfire. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't elegant, it was cold, efficient, impersonal, a machine built not for glory, but for results. And that is what made it terrifying. In one mission report from 1944, a German officer wrote, "They do not fight as we do. They arrive, they strike, and they disappear. There is no challenge, only destruction." The silence was not accidental, it was design. The fear it caused wasn't psychological fiction, it was battlefield reality. And as the war dragged on, more and more soldiers began to associate quiet skies not with safety, but with something else, imminence. If you've enjoyed learning about this remarkable aircraft and the fear it inspired, consider subscribing for more untold stories. Leave a comment with your thoughts or with a story your family may have shared from this era. Every voice matters when it comes to preserving history. In the early days of the Lightning's deployment over Europe, the German response was more dismissive than defensive. The Luftwaffe saw the P-38 as a novelty, a strange, twin-tailed aircraft flown by inexperienced American pilots who still fumbled with radio protocols and formation discipline. German aces, many of them hardened on the Eastern Front, regarded the Lightning with a mix of curiosity and contempt. They nicknamed it the flying clamp or the milk bottle with wings. It was bulky, it was different, and for a while they believed it was beatable. Part of that confidence came from years of dominance. By 1943, the Luftwaffe had built a reputation forged in the skies over France, Britain, and Russia. Their pilots were experienced, aggressive, and many flew with a kill count that bordered on myth. Men like Erich Hartmann, Gerhard Barkhorn, and Walter Novotny had shaped a culture of aerial superiority that made the appearance of a new American plane seem more amusing than threatening. They saw the P-38's twin boom structure as a liability. They assumed the American doctrine of energy fighting was unsophisticated compared to the sharp angles and tight dogfights they mastered in their nimble Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. Many Luftwaffe pilots wrote in their diaries about the P-38 being too big, too heavy, and too slow to turn. Their laughter echoed in barracks and briefing rooms. But arrogance is a slow poison. And the P-38, while imperfect, wasn't interested in playing by their rules. What the Luftwaffe failed to see was that the Lightning wasn't designed for duels. It was designed for dominance through altitude, speed, and coordination. It didn't chase dogfights. It created conditions where the enemy had no choice but to react, always one step behind. And in the silence that followed the P-38's descent, that dynamic became fatally clear. One incident stood out among many. In November 1943, over southern France, a formation of German fighters intercepted what they thought was a vulnerable group of American P-38s flying at medium altitude. Confident in their advantage, they dove in, expecting a brief skirmish before returning to base victorious. But something was different. The Lightnings didn't scatter. They didn't climb or twist into evasive patterns. They split, climbed, and reformed, and then turned as a unit. What followed was a methodical retaliation. The P-38s used coordinated fire from above, diving in with precision and pulling out at speeds the Bf-109s couldn't match. The German formation collapsed under pressure, not from superior turning, but from superior thinking. Out of 12 German fighters, 7 were lost in under 4 minutes. One of the survivors, Lieutenant Otto Brenner, later said, "We expected a schoolyard fight. What we got was mathematics in motion." American pilots had been training in a different kind of war, a war where success didn't come from instinct alone, but from calculated advantage. Boom and zoom tactics, a style where altitude is converted into speed during attack runs, became the Lightning's signature move. It was impersonal, precise, and brutally efficient. The Luftwaffe's intimate, swirling duels were replaced by quick bursts of overwhelming force and immediate disengagement. And it was this shift, this rejection of traditional combat values, that the Germans found most unsettling. Suddenly, it wasn't about who had the better reflexes. It was about who controlled the engagement. And the Americans, flying in formations led by officers trained in systems and doctrine, were beginning to show signs of something the Germans hadn't truly prepared for: industry. The Luftwaffe, for all its talent, was running out of aces. Training times had been shortened. Replacement pilots arrived with fewer hours and less confidence. The American system, by contrast, was producing more pilots every month than Germany could replace in a season. And the P-38, once dismissed as an oddball, was being flown not by isolated cowboys, but by squadrons that fought as one. Somewhere along the way, the Germans stopped laughing. Radar crews began reporting increased P-38 sightings. They were no longer confined to escort missions or reconnaissance. They were hunting trains, strafing supply lines, disrupting logistics hundreds of kilometers from the front, and more importantly, they were surviving. Pilots who returned from combat spoke of the Lightning's resilience, how it could take damage to one engine and still make it home, how its central firepower made frontal attacks devastating, and how the Americans didn't fear disengagement. They attacked, withdrew, regrouped, and returned on their terms. What the Luftwaffe didn't realize until it was too late was that the P-38 was never trying to win in a dogfight. It was trying to break the system, to change the rhythm, to redefine what air superiority looked like, and so the myth began to die. The myth that German aircraft were always faster, that their pilots were always better, that American planes were clumsy, slow, and predictable, because with every silent approach, every sudden strike, and every safe return, the Lightning erased a little more of that illusion. By early 1944, Luftwaffe Command was issuing new advisories on P-38 encounters, orders to avoid frontal engagements, warnings about altitude advantage, guidelines on how to deal with sudden dives from unseen attackers. The fork-tailed devil had become a pattern, a symbol of a shifting tide, not because it had the highest kill count, but because it forced the enemy to unlearn everything they thought they knew. What had started as mockery had turned into caution, and that caution would only deepen. If you're enjoying these stories and want to keep exploring the forgotten corners of World War II, let your curiosity guide you. Drop a comment below and tell us what surprised you most. And if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button. History needs voices like yours to stay alive. It was not the roar of jet engines or the crack of artillery that defined the battlefield that morning. It was the quiet, a quiet so deep it made the breath feel heavy. The kind of quiet that feels unnatural. The kind of quiet that meant something was wrong. Just outside the small French town of Autumn, a column of German trucks rolled cautiously along a rural road, their wheels grinding over gravel and dirt, heading toward a supply depot under increasing strain. Fuel barrels were strapped to open beds. Ammunition crates sat unsecured. The drivers were young, many barely trained, eyes scanning the hedgerows as if expecting resistance from the trees themselves. But the sky was clear, and for a moment they allowed themselves to believe it was just another delivery. The air was so still, some men opened the flaps of their canvas roofs, hoping for a breeze. They didn't notice the shift above them. At 30,000 feet, a formation of P-38 Lightnings had already spotted them. Altitude was their kingdom, and from there, they could see everything, every vehicle, every road, every weakness. The lead pilot, Captain Edward Mason, was a veteran of North Africa and had flown over 100 combat sorties. He had learned to read the terrain like a second language. What caught his attention was the spacing of the vehicles. Too organized, too regular. It screamed military transport, and Mason knew what that meant. A perfect target. He clicked his mic once. No words. The formation knew the signal. Throttle back. Begin descent. No radio chatter. Let gravity do the work. As the P-38s descended in tight silence, the drivers below still had no idea. There was no engine hum, no contrails, just birds circling lazily above the hills, until they scattered all at once, an instinct older than war. Then came the first strike. The lead Lightning opened up with its nose-mounted 50 caliber machine guns, followed by the 20mm cannon. The rounds hit the lead truck in less than a second, igniting fuel and ammunition in a chain reaction that turned the front of the convoy into an inferno. Metal bent outward, tires exploded. A man jumped from the passenger seat and was consumed mid-air by the blast. Then came the second, and the third. The remaining vehicles slammed brakes, veering into ditches, some trying to reverse blindly. But it was too late. The Lightnings came in low, their wings steady, their fire precise. No evasive maneuvers, no hesitation, just methodical sweeping passes, each one peeling another layer off the convoy. A German field radio operator stationed in a barn 2 kilometers away recorded only one thing in his log that morning. Fire came from nothing. The air was calm, and then it wasn't. There was no warning, only smoke. That silence had become the signature of the P-38's ground attack capability. It allowed the aircraft to bypass what no bomb ever could. Time. There was no countdown, No siren, no warning from spotters or radios. The P-38s didn't just strike, they deleted moments from history. 1 second, the convoy was operational. The next, it was rubble and flame. This tactical shift was not accidental. The United States Army Air Forces had recognized early that control of the skies wasn't enough. They had to control what happened beneath them. And the P-38, with its long-range, dual-engine reliability and nose-mounted accuracy, became the perfect scalpel. It didn't just attack, it hunted infrastructure. In the months leading up to the Normandy invasion, P-38s were used extensively in Operation Crossbow, targeting rail lines, bridges, and V-1 rocket sites across France. Their ability to loiter high and dive fast meant they could hit moving targets that other aircraft could only track on paper. British officers called them the Angels of Disruption. One particularly devastating mission occurred in April 1944, when P-38s intercepted a German train moving fuel reserves near Dijon. The train had no fighter escort. It wasn't supposed to need one. But the lightnings appeared over a forest ridge without a sound, then dove in sequence. They didn't drop bombs. They didn't need to. They strafed from nose to tail, setting off chain reactions in tanker cars. The fire burned for 16 hours. The station was never used again. These missions had a cumulative effect, not just on German logistics, but on morale. Troops began to distrust the roads. Convoys moved at night. Bridges were guarded by men who no longer looked up with confidence but with fear. The Luftwaffe tried to counter with increased patrols, but they couldn't be everywhere, and the P-38's reach was relentless. It could fly from Britain to eastern France and back on a single tank, and even if one engine failed, it could limp home. Many did. Crews began modifying their tactics to maximize psychological pressure. Some squadrons flew with reduced throttle until just before opening fire. Others used terrain to mask their approach, diving from the sun to blind targets. Each method was designed with one goal in mind, to give the enemy as little time as possible to react, and that is why the P-38 was feared not just by soldiers, but by entire supply chains. It didn't matter if you were armed, it didn't matter if you were ready. If the lightning had your coordinates, you were already in danger. Even generals began to feel it. Meetings in forward command posts were interrupted not by bombs but by rumors. A P-38 was seen in the area. Move now. Don't wait. Don't breathe. That kind of fear travels. It weakens the joints of an army, makes every plan more fragile, every movement more cautious, because if the silence was followed by thunder, it was already too late. Thanks for staying with us through these powerful moments of history. If this story gave you a deeper sense of how fear can be engineered from altitude and precision, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to help us keep these stories alive, subscribing is the best way to make sure they're never forgotten. It began as a rumor. A strange pattern reported by scattered outposts, whispered among fatigued soldiers at the edge of collapse. Convoys destroyed without warning. Bridges attacked before sirens could sound. Outposts struck from above while the air still seemed calm. It was not the violence that unnerved them. It was the absence of sound before it arrived. By the spring of 1944, the German High Command started receiving consistent reports from the field. The stories were eerily similar. There had been no radar contact, no audible engines, no time to prepare. A moment of strange quiet would descend over a position. Seconds later, the earth would erupt. Silence had become a signal, a sinister one. For centuries, the battlefield had trained soldiers to react to noise, the roar of horses, the crack of muskets, the rumble of tanks. Even in modern warfare, the scream of dive bombers and the thunder of artillery were cues that allowed troops to brace for impact. But what the P-38 introduced was something different. It removed the warning. It severed the link between anticipation and reaction. It rewired the psychology of war itself. German infantry began to associate periods of calm with impending violence. An unusually quiet afternoon wasn't restful. It was terrifying. Officers grew paranoid when the wind died. Field radios were, checked obsessively. Guards stared into the horizon, not for movement but for stillness. When the birds stopped singing, men reached for their helmets. The psychological impact was massive and real. Reports from units stationed in occupied France reveal that entire supply columns would delay movement if skies were too clear, not because of enemy patrols, but because they feared the silence. Motor pools were relocated. Sentries were ordered to fire warning shots at unknown aircraft even before identification. Anti-aircraft crews began exhausting ammunition on false alarms, shooting at glints in the sky that turned out to be nothing. In one chilling account from May 1944, a German sergeant based near Rouen wrote in his diary, We do not sleep anymore. We wait. We wait for the silence to be broken. We used to fear the sound. Now we fear its absence. That absence had a name. Schweigende Geister, the silent ghosts. The phrase emerged from a cracked field report written in pencil on a water-stained form. It quickly spread among units facing frequent air interdictions. The term wasn't military slang. It was born of superstition. Soldiers began using it to describe not just the P-38, but any aircraft that struck without warning. The name carried a weight heavier than steel. Because ghosts are not seen, ghosts are not heard, ghosts cannot be stopped. Commanders tried to reassert discipline. They lectured their men on tactical realities, reminding them that fear was a weapon the enemy could exploit. But the men had already drawn their own conclusions. You cannot reason with silence. In some units, rituals began to form. Mechanics knocked 3 times on the fuselage of trucks before departure. Officers carried good luck charms into briefings. Radios were kept on even when not in use, the faint hiss of static offering some psychological comfort. As long as the radio made noise, the ghosts had not arrived. But silence does not obey rituals. In one instance, a unit stationed near Bordeaux reported a series of low flyovers from unidentified aircraft. They did not engage. They did not fire. They simply passed overhead. The next day, the airfield was attacked. Not from above, but with a direct hit on its central fuel depot. The lightnings had not struck immediately. They had mapped the area, studied it, measured it in silence, then returned to erase it. That level of precision eroded morale in ways artillery never could. It was not the scale of destruction that haunted survivors. It was the surgical quality of it, the way the attacks felt preordained, as if someone had already drawn a circle around your name. One German intelligence officer submitted a post-mission analysis after his sector suffered 6 consecutive losses to low-level P-38 attacks. He concluded the following: the enemy has shifted from engaging our strength to targeting our predictability. They no longer seek confrontation. They seek inevitability. It is no exaggeration to say that silence became a strategic asset. American pilots learned to embrace it, to use it like a cloak. They cut their engines at altitude, glided with the wind, avoided radio chatter, and coordinated with subtle hand gestures in the cockpit. Some formations flew without lights, hugging cloud banks until they emerged seconds before an attack. The sky became their accomplice. That manipulation of sound had a secondary effect. It created an illusion of omnipresence. To the enemy, it seemed the Americans were everywhere, even when they were not. Every field, every crossroads, every train station carried the threat of unseen observation, the fear that a P-38 might be watching, even if no one heard it. Civilians felt it too. In rural areas of France, farmers began warning each other about the sudden quiet. Some stopped working during certain times of day. Others refused to travel by cart. The countryside learned the rhythm of fear. When the air stood still, the ground prepared to mourn. What had begun as a tactical method evolved into a psychological weapon, and like all powerful weapons, it left a trail of stories behind, not just of destruction, but of the people who lived in its shadow, of soldiers who hesitated, of commanders who broke protocol, of mechanics who refused to go near airstrips during blue skies. The silence had changed them. If this chapter of forgotten warfare moved you in any way, let us know your thoughts below. Every comment you leave helps bring human memory closer to the forefront of history. And if you're finding value in these untold stories, subscribing is your way of keeping memory alive and honored. It is often said that wars are won not just by strategy, but by supply, that while the soldier pulls the trigger, it is the factory that loads the gun. Nowhere was this more true than in the skies over Europe in the 1940s, and few aircraft embodied that reality more than the P-38 Lightning, not because it was the best fighter in every category, but because it could be built, repaired, and deployed again and again without pause. The P-38 was never meant to be a rare jewel of engineering. It was born in Burbank, California, on the factory floor of Lockheed, where innovation met repetition. Over 10,000 units would be built by the end of the war, and while each Lightning was an intricate machine of speed, balance, and firepower, it was also a product of an industrial rhythm that never stopped beating. American war production had become something unprecedented. Entire cities shifted into wartime motion. Assembly lines that once built cars and typewriters now churned out aircraft fuselages and 50-caliber barrels. Women replaced men on the production floor. Posters declared Rosie the Riveter a symbol of strength, and behind every P-38 that rose into the sky, there were thousands of hands that made it possible. The Luftwaffe, for all its tactical skill and battle-hardened pilots, was being outbuilt. German industry, already stretched thin by the Eastern Front and strategic bombing, could not compete with the scale or pace of American factories. For every Bf-109 Germany could repair, the United States could ship 5 P-38s across the Atlantic. The numbers were not just on the American side, they were overwhelming it. But sheer volume wasn't the only factor. Each Lightning was designed for survivability. Its twin-engine layout meant that even with one engine shot out, a pilot could limp home across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. There were countless accounts of battered Lightnings landing with one engine smoking, fuselage riddled with holes, and hydraulics barely functioning. Ground crews would swarm the moment the wheels touched down, patch the damage, rearm the guns, and often have the same aircraft flying again within 48 hours. That kind of resilience mattered, because while the Luftwaffe was losing irreplaceable aces, the Americans were returning pilots to the air, not always heroes, often just men who got lucky, but luck that survived became experience, and experience turned into consistency. A machine that came back gave its pilot another mission. A squadron that endured built momentum, and in a war of attrition, momentum was gold. The Germans noticed. They couldn't ignore it. By early 1944, Luftwaffe intelligence officers were sending memos warning that the American war machine had achieved continuous rotation, a phrase that meant fresh squadrons were always arriving. Damaged aircraft were being repaired faster than destroyed, and logistics hubs in England were functioning like well-oiled machines. It was, in their words, a war of factories as much as pilots. They were not wrong. American bomber groups were flanked by fresh P-38s nearly every week. Some came directly from manufacturing plants. Others were recycled war horses, given new engines, new paint, and sometimes new pilots. The turnover was relentless, but never chaotic. Every Lightning had a place, serial number, a maintenance crew, and a mission. And the missions were expanding. What began as a high-altitude escort aircraft was now fulfilling multiple roles. The P-38 was bombing trains, escorting B-17s deep into Germany, flying photographic reconnaissance, and even serving as a long-range attack aircraft in the Pacific. It was not specialized, it was adaptive. Its modular design allowed for easy upgrades, whether that meant adding rocket pods, fitting external tanks, or changing armament configurations. It could be what the war needed whenever it needed it. The Luftwaffe had no such flexibility. German aircraft were beautifully engineered, but often too delicate for battlefield conditions. They needed specific parts, unique repair teams, and often took weeks to restore. The American system worked differently. Speed was valued more than perfection. A plane didn't have to be flawless. It had to fly, shoot, and return. If it could do that, it was ready for another mission. And so, the P-38 became more than a plane. It became a symbol of something larger. Not just American air power, but American industrial philosophy. Solve problems fast, keep the line moving, make it work, then make it better, and keep doing it until there are no enemies left to face it. One German pilot, after being shot down and captured, reportedly asked his interrogator how many planes the Americans still had. When told that the factories had no intention of slowing down, he simply replied, "Then the war is already over." He wasn't wrong. The tide was turning not just in the skies but on the ground beneath the assembly lines. At the Lockheed plant, workers kept photographs of pilots who had flown the P-38 in combat. Some pinned notes from returned veterans to the breakroom walls. Others etched names into engine housings before they were shipped off. There was pride, but also urgency. Everyone knew the stakes. Everyone understood the silence their aircraft could create above the battlefields of Europe. The war was not won by one aircraft, but the Lightning helped make victory inevitable. It struck hard, returned home, and struck again, day after day, week after week, not because it was invincible, but because it was replaceable, repairable, repeatable. That is what the Luftwaffe could never match. Not just a plane that performed, but a system that never stopped delivering it. And that is how silence became mass-produced. If you've made it this far, thank you for giving space to the stories behind the machines. We'd love to hear your reflections in the comments. And if you'd like to be part of keeping these stories alive, subscribing helps more than you know. Let's keep memory flying. Long after the war ended and the skies over Europe went quiet for good, the testimonies began to emerge. Not in strategy briefings or polished memoirs, but in handwritten journals, declassified field reports, and quiet interviews given decades later by men who had witnessed something they could never quite forget. Because what lingered in their minds was not the roar of engines or the sound of explosions. It was the silence that came before them. Hans Keller, a former German radar operator stationed near Nancy in early 1944, had never spoken publicly about the incident that haunted him for years. But in a letter written to a local historian in 1961, he finally put pen to paper. He described that morning in painful detail, the way the radar screen flickered normally until it suddenly went blank. No echo, no interference, just nothing. The radio was still active, the instruments were functional, but the air, as he wrote, felt hollow. Within minutes, the fuel depot just north of the base erupted into a fireball. Ammunition stored nearby went up next. The entire east sector was lost, and the planes responsible were never seen. He ended the letter with a sentence that carried the weight of every man who had stood in that same silence. I never feared the aircraft. I feared the moment before. That feeling was not isolated. Veterans on both sides spoke of a specific kind of dread, not during the attack, but just before it. A sense of being watched, of being selected, of being measured by something they could not detect. American pilots, too, carried their own stories, but theirs came from the opposite side of the silence. They were the ones creating it. Captain Lawrence Dusty Granger flew over 80 missions in Europe in a P-38. He was known among his crew for flying clean and speaking little. After the war, he rarely shared stories, but during a reunion in 1972, he opened up for the first time. What struck him most, he said, was not the combat itself, but the feeling of isolation during those long, gliding approaches. The engines cut back, the headset quiet, the world below unaware. He called it the ghost pass. There was a moment, he said, just before we pulled the trigger, where the whole earth seemed to hold its breath. Those words echoed through the room, because everyone there knew exactly what he meant. Some stories were more direct. A French farmer named Marcel Picard recounted a morning when he had been out tending his fields near Chalon-sur-Saône. It was still early, the mist low and clinging to the ground. He remembered noticing how the birds had all taken off at once, as if spooked by something that made no sound. Minutes later, the tracks along the nearby railway exploded in a perfectly timed sequence. The train had been carrying fuel to the Atlantic Wall. Marcel never saw the planes, but he never forgot the quiet. And then, there were the interrogations. Captured German officers and enlisted men were often questioned about the psychological impact of Allied air power. In one such transcript from June 1944, a logistics officer admitted something that struck the interpreter as deeply personal. He said, "We feared your bombers, we feared your fighters, but we respected them. What we did not understand was the one that made no noise, the one that came only once, and then never again." The P-38 had become something more than a weapon. It was now an experience, a phenomenon. To those who survived its wrath, it was a memory tied to a feeling, not of terror in the moment, but of helplessness before the moment began. That helplessness left a scar. Across dozens of Allied mission logs, entries were written with clinical precision. Target engaged, enemy fire returned, objective destroyed, but buried. Between the lines were human details. Phrases like "no resistance detected" or "attack executed before target could react." These weren't just statements of tactical advantage. They were reflections of something the Americans had come to understand, that the element of silence was not just a shield, it was a sword. Post-war studies by both sides explored how sound, or the lack of it, shaped combat effectiveness. British researchers interviewed pilots who claimed they performed better when their aircraft created less noise. Some even admitted to modifying flight patterns to reduce sonic signatures. German analysts reached similar conclusions, noting that delayed response times from ground crews often correlated with attacks that began in silence. Even today, military doctrine incorporates lessons first learned through those missions: the use of sound suppression, the value of acoustic deception, the importance of the unseen over the merely powerful. All of it can be traced back to those. Lightning runs in the quiet skies over Europe, but numbers and studies only tell part of the story. The full truth lies in the human reactions, in the stammering voices of men decades later, recalling a moment they cannot fully explain, in the cold sweat that still visited them in dreams, in the silence they could still hear. Not every pilot got a medal, not every mission made headlines, but the legacy of the P-38 Lightning lives on in the minds of those who knew what it meant to be on the receiving end of a strike so fast, so clean, so devoid of warning that it rewired their understanding of what air power truly was. It was not brute force. It was the manipulation of perception. It was the weaponization of absence. Thank you for making space for stories that rarely make the front pages of history books. If this account spoke to something in you, a memory, a feeling, or simply curiosity, leave a comment, share your thoughts, or just say hello. And if you're new here, subscribing helps these untold moments echo further than silence ever could. There is a truth about war that rarely finds its way into documentaries or parades. The clean victories and precise maneuvers that history likes to remember often leave something behind. The faces of the men who never got to choose the fight, the civilians caught beneath contrails, the hands that shook long after the trigger had been pulled, and when it came to the missions flown by the P-38 Lightning, that truth was unavoidable. Because in the silence left by the aircraft's sudden appearance and violent precision, there were always consequences, real ones, human ones. The P-38 did not fight in grand battles with waving flags and clear front lines. It hunted railways. It burned convoys. It destroyed fuel lines in the dead of night. It was often deployed where no defense was expected, where the enemy had not yet drawn a weapon, and when its guns opened fire, the people on the receiving end didn't always have a chance to react, sometimes not even to realize what was happening before it was over. American pilots understood the power of their aircraft. They respected it, but they also carried its weight. Lieutenant Frank Weathers, a 24-year-old pilot from Kansas, flew dozens of sorties in Europe. In a letter to his father, dated June 18, 1944, he wrote, "The last train we hit wasn't carrying troops. It had fuel and supplies, but there were also a few civilians on board. I saw a boy through the smoke. Just for a second, I don't know if he made it. I tell myself he did, but I can't unsee him." That single paragraph survived the war longer than most of his medals. There are countless similar stories. Pilots trained to execute missions with mechanical precision were also men with eyes and memories. Many had only seconds to identify targets before releasing fire, and in those seconds, they had to separate intention from instinct. Was the truck part of a military column or a fleeing family? Was the building a command post or a farmhouse? There was no room for debate at 400 miles per hour, but the aftermath was not just debris and reports. It was also guilt. It was wondering, years later, about the lives unintentionally altered or erased by an attack that had followed every protocol. The P-38's very effectiveness made those moments more common. Its ability to strike without warning and vanish before resistance could be organized often meant that return fire was minimal. Missions were successful. Kill counts were recorded. Supply lines were cut, but the emotional toll was rarely tallied. For the soldiers on the ground, especially those in retreat or transport, the sudden appearance of the Lightning became something more than a military event. It was a sentence, a strike from nowhere, a judgment they had no voice in. Some tried to fight back. Others simply ran. Many didn't get that chance. One German dispatch from late 1944 documented an intercepted P-38 attack on a moving column. Among the dead were young logistics officers, none over the age of 20, transporting rations to a forward unit. They never saw their attackers. Their unit's commander later wrote, "It was not a battle, it was an erasure." And on the other side of that erasure stood the crews who returned to base, often greeted with handshakes and warm meals. After-action reports were filed, kill markings painted on fuselages, but for some pilots, the noise of celebration rang hollow, because even perfect missions could leave invisible wounds. In some debriefings, squadron leaders noted behavioral changes, pilots growing quiet, withdrawing, avoiding rest between missions. They weren't broken, but they were carrying something unspoken, something that didn't fit neatly into the narrative of victory. There were efforts to prepare them for it. Briefings emphasized target profiles. Intelligence teams worked to reduce collateral risk, but no amount of planning could erase the reality of war at low altitude. A split-second decision could mean survival for one group and devastation for another. In many ways, the Lightning was a paradox. It saved countless Allied lives by neutralizing enemy infrastructure. It shortened battles. It disrupted enemy retreats. It prevented reinforcements. Yet in doing so, it forced its pilots to confront the moral gravity of action without confrontation. That is the uncomfortable truth of air power at its most effective. There is no warning. There is no conversation. There is only judgment. And yet the pilots flew, day after day, mission after mission, because they believed that their efforts were saving lives in the long run, that by ending supply chains today, they were preventing bloodshed tomorrow, that by striking now, they were bringing the war closer to its end. History will never fully know how many lives were spared because of those decisions. just as it will never fully account for those lost by mistake, by timing, or by the fog of war. But what must be remembered is this: these were not just missions carried out by machines. They were stories lived by men. Men who, long after the war, still heard the silence, still saw the flash of the moment, still wondered about the people on the ground. If you felt the weight of this part of the story, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Real history lives not just in the past, but in how we choose to remember it. And if you believe in honoring those memories with truth and reflection, subscribing helps more than you might imagine. Thank you for being part of that. They called it the fork-tailed devil, a machine forged in metal and ambition, sent across oceans by a nation that had decided to make war not just with courage, but with scale. To its pilots, it was a partner, a guardian, sometimes even a coffin. To its enemies, it was something else entirely, a shadow that arrived without sound, struck without mercy, and vanished before the sky could even register the wound. The P-38. Lightning did not ask for glory. It did not demand attention like the sleeker Mustang or the elegant Spitfire. It was not designed to be admired. It was designed to end things, to end convoys, to end transmissions, to end the illusion of safety. And in doing so, it became a symbol of a deeper truth about the war in the air. It was not just a battle of pilots. It was a war of systems, of logistics, of pressure, applied not to the enemy's front lines, but to their spine. And the lightning, fast, high-flying, long-ranged and ever-present, was the hand pressing down. Its silence was not a technical feature. It was an emotional weapon. In that silence, soldiers hesitated. Crews delayed their movements. Entire strategies unraveled before the first bullet ever hit. It is difficult to measure fear. It cannot be counted like bomb loads or sortie reports, but anyone who served under the threat of the P-38 knew exactly what it felt like. That quiet moment before the strike, that heartbeat of stillness, that realization that you were already in someone's sights. The sky became a place of questions. Is it there? Is it watching? Can it see us? And then, by the time those questions found answers, it was already too late. The Germans had no equivalent. Their aircraft were fast, often superior in agility, flown by veterans. But they were few, and they were stretched thin. For every ace they lost, it took months to replace them. For every lightning brought down, another would land in. England within days, fueled and ready. This was the war's quiet lesson. Not that one pilot could tip the balance, but that industry could. And in that silence, industrialized fear took flight. By 1945, the Luftwaffe was a ghost of its former self. Once proud, once feared, now overwhelmed by volume and time. The fork-tailed devil had done its job, not alone, but with precision, with consistency, with an absence of sound that haunted the men on the ground more than the chaos that followed. Veterans on both sides later agreed on one thing. The P-38 did not play fair. It didn't ask for a duel. It rewrote the rules. It didn't need to fight you if it could erase your fuel, your food, your trains, and your roads. And if it did fight you, it did so from above at a speed you couldn't match, from an angle you couldn't reach. You were fighting a machine, yes, but behind that machine stood a continent of factories, engineers, and logistics officers who had one goal: to end the war by making you realize it was unwinnable. And that is what made the silence so unbearable. It wasn't just a lack of sound. It was a presence. It was the weight of inevitability. It was not just a plane. It was a signal that the war had entered its final chapter, that the tide had turned, that the skies no longer belonged to the boldest, but to the most prepared, that the roar of past battles was being replaced by something colder, more efficient, more absolute. In that final year, Luftwaffe veterans no longer joked about the fork-tailed devil. They no longer mocked its shape or questioned its tactics. They understood. They respected it, because they had seen it. They had felt it, not in their bones, but in the long, dreadful pause before the strike, in the silence before everything changed. And perhaps that is what lingers most. Not the thunder of the guns, not the blast of the explosions, but the sound the P-38 made just before it came into view. None. To those who stood under that sky, silence was not emptiness. It was the future arriving faster than they could react. It was a lesson written not in textbooks, but in smoke and dust and memory. So the next time you hear a story about World War II that begins with noise, remember the one that began without it, because silence too has a sound, and during those final years of war it sounded like twin engines gliding at altitude, like a shadow moving across fields, like a promise kept by thousands of hands, building thousands of planes with the quiet intention of ending the fight before it began. Thank you for joining us on this journey through forgotten skies, where echoes of steel and silence still shape the world we live in. If this story moved you, or reminded you of someone you once knew, a relative, a name on a wall, or just a feeling, we invite you to share that memory in the comments. It deserves to be heard, and if you'd like to explore more moments that history tried to leave behind, go ahead and click on the next video that's now appearing on your screen. There's always another chapter waiting to be discovered. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.